Krishna and the Melody of the Monsoon. Morning broke gently over Vrindavan. The first light of dawn stretched its golden fingers across the treetops, painting the forest leaves with a soft, honeyed glow. Dewdrops clung to every blade of grass, glistening like tiny jewels under the morning sun. The air was fresh with the clean scent of earth after night's rest, carrying the quiet hum of nature slowly waking. Birdsong echoed softly from the high branches, warblers, bulbuls, and cuckoos calling their first notes of the day. The gentle rustling of leaves blended with the distant murmur of the Yamuna River, its silver-blue waters weaving calmly through the land. Near the edge of the forest, cows wandered slowly, their soft bellows blending with the music of nature. Their tails flicked lazily, swatting away flies as they grazed on fresh green grass. It was a morning like any other, but in the heart of it all, something stirred that made even the birds pause. There, beneath a great kadamba tree, sat a figure as still as the roots beneath him. His skin was the deep blue of stormy skies after the rain, his eyes dark, yet filled with a gentle, endless calm, like gazing into the midnight sea. Around his head, the soft glow of the rising sun framed his silhouette like a quiet halo. He wore a simple yellow dhoti that shimmered faintly like sunlit silk, and a garland of wild forest flowers hung around his neck, fresh petals brushing softly against his chest. This was Krishna. His face held the kind of peace that even sages strive for after years of meditation. His smile was small, but playful, as though every thought in his mind was a secret joke only he could hear. His eyes, sharp as a heron's gaze, watched the world around him with quiet delight. But it was not his gaze or his smile that caught the attention of the forest that day. It was the flute. In his hands, he held it lightly, his fingers resting on its smooth bamboo surface. The air around him stilled. The wind softened to a whisper. Even the birds tilted their heads toward him, their songs falling quiet. His eyes closed. His lips touched the flute. Then he played. The sound that followed was unlike anything in the world. It was not just music. It was the soft lull of rain falling on dry soil, the distant roll of thunder heard from under a safe roof, the hush of waves breaking gently on a shore. The melody moved through the air with a sweetness so tender that every creature in Vrindavan paused to listen. The leaves trembled with delight. The cows stopped grazing and raised their heads, ears flicking toward the sound. A pair of peacocks, perched on a low branch, unfurled their tails, feathers shimmering like emeralds and sapphires. The melody was slow, like the rhythm of a steady heart. Each note hung in the air as if reluctant to leave. Birds swooped down from the treetops, perching on low branches to hear it more clearly. The forest, which had been a symphony of birds, insects, and flowing water, fell into a perfect hush. Even the Yamuna's rippling waters seemed to slow. Krishna's fingers danced lightly on the flute, his eyes still closed as though he, too, was listening to the music, not making it. His head tilted slightly, swaying gently with the notes. It was as if he was playing the heartbeat of the world itself. Then, something shifted. A breeze, cool and sharp, swept through the trees. It rustled the leaves with a sound like distant applause. The dewdrops trembled on the edges of the grass before falling to the ground. one by one. The fragrance of wet earth filled the air, that sweet, familiar smell that comes before rain. Krishna's eyes slowly opened, his fingers pausing on the flute. He gazed toward the east, where the sky, still painted in soft morning hues, now showed a thin line of gray clouds stretching just above the horizon. They moved slowly, curling like smoke drifting from a fire, their edges lined with silver light. Krishna tilted his head. His gaze was steady, thoughtful. He tapped the edge of his flute against his palm, his eyes still fixed on the distant clouds. His playful smile faded into quiet curiosity. "The monsoon is near," he said softly, his voice smooth and calm like a river at dusk. His fingers rolled the flute gently between them, like a potter shaping clay. But the clouds seemed troubled. The wind blew again, carrying the scent of rain and something else, a heaviness, a quiet tension hidden within the sweetness of the air. It was the smell of change. Krishna felt it. The birds felt it too, for their songs grew soft, more watchful than joyous. He glanced up toward the peacocks perched on the branch, their heads tilted, their eyes locked on the distant clouds. The feathers of their tails shimmered faintly, sensing something only they could know. Krishna's gaze lingered on the sky for a moment longer. Then, without a word, he raised the flute once more. This time, the melody was different. It was not the slow hum of rain, but something quieter, like the soft steps of someone walking through a misty forest path. The notes rose and fell like the flutter of a butterfly's wings. It was a gentle song, thoughtful and unhurried, a song for travelers, a song for journeys. The breeze circled around him, carrying the sound deeper into the forest. The notes drifted into the trees, weaving through the branches and over the leaves, like threads drawn through a loom. It moved beyond Vrindavan, further than the edge of the river, past the wild groves where the kadamba flowers bloomed. The song called to something beyond sight, beyond sound. Somewhere deep in the eastern woods, something stirred. Krishna lowered his flute, his gaze still thoughtful, his eyes calm but watchful. He glanced to the east again, where the gray clouds had grown darker, thicker. They curled and rolled as if unsure of themselves, like waves that did not know which shore they belonged to. His eyes lingered on them for a moment longer before he rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He dusted off his yellow dhoti and adjusted the garland of flowers around his neck. His eyes narrowed in quiet decision. With the flute in hand, he turned toward the path that led into the heart of the forest. His steps were light, barely touching the ground, each one as soft as a fallen leaf. Behind him, the cows lowered their heads and resumed grazing. The birds resumed their songs, though gentler than before. The river's soft murmur returned, but in the heart of the grove, where Krishna's music had once played, there was a stillness that did not fade. As Krishna walked, the peacocks followed. They leapt from their perch, gliding down behind him. Slowly, step by step, he made his way toward the gray clouds. The wind followed him, and the air grew cooler, each breath tasting faintly of rain. The morning glow was still soft and warm, but at the edge of the world, the clouds waited. The monsoon had heard his call. The path ahead was quiet, but alive. Each step Krishna took was soft, as if the forest welcomed him with every press of his bare feet. The sun hung low in the sky, casting slanted beams of light that filtered through the thick canopy. Shafts of gold broke through the green leaves, creating pools of soft illumination on the forest floor. The wind followed him, and the air grew cooler, each breath tasting faintly of rain. The morning glow was still soft and warm, but at the edge of the world, the clouds waited. The monsoon had heard his call. The path ahead was quiet, but alive. Each step Krishna took was soft, as if the forest welcomed him with every press of his bare feet. The sun hung low in the sky, casting slanted beams of light that filtered through the thick canopy. Shafts of gold broke through the green leaves, creating pools of soft illumination on the forest floor. Krishna tilted his head in its direction, his lips curling into a smile. "Ah, even the cuckoo sings of the rain," he said softly. "The forest knows before we do." The path twisted ahead, framed by roots that jutted from the ground like the ribs of a sleeping beast. Krishna stepped over them with ease, his feet moving lightly, as if each step were part of a dance only he could hear. Then, a flicker of blue caught his eye. A butterfly. It was no ordinary butterfly. Its wings shimmered with hues of brilliant blue, as if the sky itself had lent it color. Tiny patterns of silver dots lined its wings, like specks of stardust. It fluttered close, hovering just in front of Krishna's face. For a moment, it hovered there, its wings moving in slow, steady pulses. Then it darted away, only to return, circling him like a playful child tugging on a parent's hand. Krishna laughed softly. "Are you leading me somewhere, little one?" he asked. The butterfly fluttered ahead, darting through the air like a flicker of blue flame. It hovered by a twist in the path, then danced forward, as if urging him to follow. Krishna raised an eyebrow, his smile growing wider. "Then lead on, guide of the forest," he said, his steps falling in sync with its flight. With each twist and turn of the path, the world grew more enchanted. The soft hum of insects filled the air, and the light filtering through the canopy took on a cool, bluish-green glow. The roots on the path became more tangled, their shapes curling like sleeping serpents. Small mushrooms sprouted from the sides of trees, their caps the color of amber and rust. Fireflies flickered in the shadows, their tiny lights blinking like distant stars in a twilight sky, even though it was still day. The butterfly flitted ahead, always pausing just long enough for Krishna to catch up. It hovered, darted forward, hovered again. It seemed to know the path better than any guide. But then, as he rounded a bend, a soft cry reached his ears, a sound so small, so faint, that most would have missed it. But Krishna's ears were sharp, and his heart was softer still. It was the cry of something small, something afraid. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around the forest. The butterfly circled back, fluttering just above his head. Then he saw it. Tucked between two low branches, half hidden by the underbrush, was a small fawn. Its golden brown coat was dappled with white spots like fallen petals. Its small body trembled, its sides heaving with quick, shallow breaths. Its wide, innocent eyes were filled with fear. One of its tiny legs was pinned beneath a thick branch that had fallen, its weight too heavy for the little creature to lift. Krishna crouched low, his eyes softening. His voice was as gentle as the first drop of rain. "Shh, all is well, little one," he murmured. The fawn's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but its body stayed tense, ready to flee if it could. Krishna did not reach for it right away. He stayed still, his gaze calm, his breathing slow. He tilted his head ever so slightly, letting the fawn see him, letting it understand that he was no threat. Slowly, he reached for the branch. With a single hand, he lifted it, the weight as light as a dry leaf in his palm. The fawn's eyes darted toward him, wide with shock. For a moment, it did not move, its body frozen with doubt. Krishna tilted his head and nodded toward the space now free of the branch. "Go on," he said softly, his smile as light as the glow of dawn. "Your mother is waiting." From the shadows, a larger figure emerged. The mother deer stepped out, her eyes locked on Krishna. Her legs were poised to flee, but she didn't run. She watched him with cautious eyes, her breath slow and measured. For a moment, everything was still. Krishna gazed at her, his face serene, his hands open and empty. The mother deer snorted softly, her ears flicking forward. She stepped closer. Her nose touched the fawn's back, nudging it forward. The fawn stumbled once, but quickly righted itself, its little legs wobbly, but eager to follow. Both of them disappeared into the underbrush, their soft footfalls fading into the stillness of the forest. Krishna watched them until they were gone. His gaze lingered on the path where they had fled. He pressed his hand lightly against the bark of a tree and exhaled slowly. "Even the smallest life deserves a gentle hand," he whispered. The butterfly landed softly on his shoulder, its wings folded together, and it sat quietly, as if it too had witnessed something important. Krishna tilted his head to it and grinned. "Back to leading, are you?" he said with a wink. The butterfly took flight once more, circling his head before darting forward, leading him deeper into the heart of the forest. The grove of the Monsoon. As he followed the butterfly, the air grew cooler still. The sounds of the forest softened. The rustling of leaves was hushed, like whispers from unseen mouths. The air took on a faint mist, curling in thin tendrils around the base of trees. Small wildflowers in shades of white and violet lined the path, and the fireflies grew more numerous, blinking softly in the shadows. The ground was no longer dirt, but moss, soft, springy moss that felt cool beneath his feet. The trees here were older, their trunks wider than a man could wrap his arms around. Their roots curled like ancient hands, rising and falling from the earth, as if they had once moved and then fallen still. Krishna paused, his eyes scanning the forest ahead. His fingers brushed the edge of his flute. He tilted his head, listening. The air was different here, heavy. It wasn't just the smell of rain. It was something else. A stillness too quiet, a pause too long. The butterfly hovered at the edge of a wide, open glade. Beyond it, the trees pulled back, revealing a circular clearing surrounded by ancient trees. In the center of this clearing, smooth, flat stones lay in a perfect circle, each one worn smooth by the soft tap of falling rain. Above, the clouds churned. Krishna stepped forward, his gaze lifting to the sky. The gray clouds had grown thicker, their edges swirling slowly like the surface of a great ocean. Lightning flickered deep within, faint but constant. Thunder rumbled, low and distant, like the sound of a drumbeat heard through stone. A single drop of rain fell on his cheek. It rolled down his skin like a silver pearl. The butterfly darted ahead, rising high into the sky before disappearing into the clouds. Krishna gazed after it, his eyes full of quiet understanding. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze lifting to the swirling clouds. The rain grew steady, each drop falling softly on his skin. He stood at the edge of the grove, his eyes closed, his face lifted to the rain. He let it soak him, his hair, his garland of flowers, his simple yellow dhoti. The coolness of the rain felt like a blessing from the clouds themselves. A slow, steady smile curved across his face. His eyes opened, and his gaze swept over the grove. He raised his hand, holding the flute before him. He turned it slowly, his fingers tapping softly on its surface. The rain played its own rhythm on the leaves, soft and steady. Krishna tilted his head, listening to the song that had already begun. And then, with a breath as soft as the breeze, he raised the flute to his lips. The rain fell like a song of its own. Soft, steady drops pattered against the wide leaves of the ancient trees, each note adding to the quiet symphony of the monsoon grove. The air smelled of fresh earth and blooming wildflowers, and the mist curled around the bases of the trees like wisps of silver thread. Every raindrop seemed to hum with its own melody, blending with the sound of the thunder's distant heartbeat. Krishna stood in the heart of the grove, his eyes lifted toward the swirling sky. The gray clouds above churned slowly, their edges lined with faint silver. Lightning flickered deep within, like a lantern glowing behind thick fog. His garland of flowers clung to his chest, the petals heavy with rain. His yellow dhoti, once bright and crisp, now clung to his legs, soaked through with water. But none of it troubled him. His dark blue skin glistened like polished stone under the rain, each droplet tracing a slow path down his arms and face. His eyes, calm as a still lake under the moon, remained fixed on the clouds. He could hear it, not with his ears, but with something deeper. The pulse of the rain, the quiet rhythm of the world. The steady heartbeat of the monsoon. Slowly, he brought his flute to his lips. The first note was soft, as gentle as the first raindrop falling on dry soil. It echoed through the grove, hanging in the air like a feather caught in the wind. The rain seemed to pause for a heartbeat. The sound of it grew softer, quieter, as if it, too, was listening. Then came the next note, this one longer, deeper. It moved like a ripple across the pond, spreading outward. The air shifted. The mist swirled at his feet. The trees, silent and still just moments before, began to sway. Their wide leaves tilted with the rhythm of the sound, catching the rain in small pools before letting it drip slowly to the earth below. Another note, then another. The flute's melody wove itself into the air, slow and patient. It wasn't a song for haste. It was the music of patience, of letting each moment stretch as far as it could go. Every note echoed with the softness of rain touching petals, the steady tap, tap, tap of water meeting stone. It was a lullaby for the world. Then he moved. His first step was as light as a falling leaf. His foot pressed into the mossy ground without a sound, his weight shifting with the grace of a bird landing on a branch. His arms followed, his hands flowing like soft currents of water. His steps were slow, unhurried, deliberate. Every movement echoed the rhythm of the rain, matching its steady pat, pat, pat on the leaves above. He twirled once, his garland of flowers spinning with him, droplets of water flying off like tiny beads of glass. His peacock feather, still tucked in his hair, swayed and spun with every turn. His movements were not sharp or sudden. They were smooth, each step gliding into the next, his feet barely leaving the ground. His arms rose and fell like waves, his fingers tracing patterns in the air, as if weaving invisible threads into the mist. The grove responded. A peacock cried from the edge of the clearing, its voice sharp as a bell. It leapt from the low branch where it perched, its feathers unfurling into a magnificent fan of emerald green and sapphire blue. The rain struck its feathers, creating a shimmer of light that danced with every step it took. Another peacock followed, then another. They stepped into the clearing, their tails fully spread, their necks arched like the curves of crescent moons. Their feet moved lightly over the wet ground, their steps quick and precise. Their eyes, small but sharp, stayed locked on Krishna as he moved. One of them spun, following the rhythm of his flute. Another flapped its wings once, hopping forward before turning in a slow, deliberate circle. More creatures joined. Frogs, hidden near the roots of the trees, began to croak in rhythm with the rain. Their short, low sounds filled the air, blending with the song of the flute. Little green tree frogs clung to the bark of the trees, their wide eyes blinking slowly as they watched the dance unfold. The fireflies returned. Their tiny golden lights flickered in the dim air, matching the slow pulse of the music. One by one, they floated into the clearing, their lights blinking in sync with Krishna's flute. They swirled around him like tiny stars circling a distant planet, tracing trails of gold as they moved. The rain itself seemed to listen. Each drop struck the leaves, the stones, the grass, in perfect rhythm with the dance. It was no longer random. It was a song only the rain knew how to play. Krishna spun once more, his feet gliding in a wide circle, his arms raised toward the sky. The wind joined him, swirling gently around his figure, picking up the ends of his yellow dhoti and making it billow like a flag caught in a breeze. His garland of flowers spun with him, the petals scattering drops of water in all directions. He stepped back, his foot landing softly on a smooth, flat stone. His movement slowed, his fingers gliding through the air like fish swimming in clear water. His eyes, always calm, were filled with quiet joy. Not the wild joy of victory, but the soft, enduring joy of a moment truly lived. More animals joined. Rabbits poked their heads from beneath the roots, their soft, twitching noses sniffing the air. Parrots, bright green with flashes of red, flew down from the canopy, landing lightly on branches just above him. Their eyes darted from Krishna to the peacocks, then back to him, their heads tilting as if following every note of his flute. The rain grew heavier, but it did not feel harsh. Each drop fell softly, like petals drifting from a flower. The peacocks, soaked as they were, continued their dance, spinning with elegance as their tails fanned out behind them like brilliant wheels of color. The animals did not speak. They did not need to. Every frog, every bird, every firefly, and every raindrop followed the same song. It was a dance not just for Krishna, but for the whole forest. His feet pressed lightly into the mossy ground, and with each step, a fresh imprint was left, only to be washed away by the rain a moment later. Time melted away. Minutes, hours, none of it mattered. The world became only rain, movement, and song. The grove had become a single, living heartbeat. Every raindrop, every rustling leaf, every blink of a firefly was part of it. And at its center, Krishna moved with the grace of the moon, dancing on still water. His smile was soft, his gaze distant, his mind focused on nothing but the rhythm of the rain and the softness of the world around him. He spun one last time, his arms outstretched, his flute held lightly in one hand. His foot pressed firmly against the smooth stone at the center of the clearing. His eyes closed. The flute's final note echoed. The peacocks stopped. The fireflies dimmed their lights. The frogs fell silent. And in that still moment, there was nothing but the soft patter of rain. Krishna lowered his flute, breathing softly, his smile barely visible on his face. His eyes opened slowly, gazing out at the grove as if seeing it anew. His garland, soaked and heavy, hung against his chest. His dhoti, wet and clinging, swayed lightly in the breeze. The world was still. No bird sang, no frog called. The only sound was the soft, steady tap of raindrops on leaves. He glanced up at the clouds, his eyes narrowing slightly. "They are still troubled," he said softly, as if speaking to the clouds themselves. His fingers ran along the edge of the flute. There is still something hidden in the rain. Far in the distance, a crack of thunder rolled through the sky. It was not loud, but it was sharp. Not like the steady beat of a drum, but like the snap of a rope pulled too tight. Krishna's eyes flickered with understanding. His gaze shifted toward the river beyond the grove, where ripples spread in slow, unnatural patterns. Something moved in the water. "Ah," Krishna murmured, his eyes glinting with quiet recognition. "You've come too, have you?" The rain grew heavier. Thunder echoed once more. The ripples in the water grew stronger. Krishna tilted his head, his gaze steady but calm. He stepped lightly from the stone, his bare feet pressing into the soft moss. He raised his flute once more. "The dance is not over," he said softly. The soft rhythm of rain tapping on leaves continued, but something had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a ripple of unease that passed through the grove like a shiver up the spine. The fireflies' glow dimmed, and even the frogs, who had been croaking in steady rhythm, fell silent one by one. The world seemed to hold its breath. Krishna's eyes turned slowly toward the river on the edge of the grove. The once clear waters, shimmering with silver reflections from the rain, now moved unnaturally. The ripples were sharp, like something was stirring beneath the surface. No fish caused ripples that large. No turtle. No bird. A low, deep hiss echoed from the water's edge, slithering through the mist like the sharp drag of a blade over stone. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. The steady pulse of the rain suddenly felt like the ticking of a drum just before battle. Krishna stepped forward slowly, his eyes calm but watchful. His fingers curled gently around the flute in his hand. He knew this sound. He had heard it once before, near the far bend of the Yamuna River, where fishermen dared not tread. The mist by the water swirled thicker, curling in tight spirals, and through that mist, a shape rose. First, there was the gleam of black scales, slick with rain and shining like polished stone. Then, slowly, a large head emerged. The shape was unmistakable, a serpent. But this was no ordinary snake. Its eyes glowed like burning coals, and its hood flared wide like a blackened parasol, its edges lined with streaks of deep crimson. From behind it, more heads emerged, one after the other, 5 in total, each one identical to the last. Their tongues flicked in and out, tasting the air, and their eyes locked on Krishna. This was Kaliya, the great serpent of the Yamuna, feared by every creature in the forest. The frogs croaked once, loudly, then all at once fell into silence. The peacocks, so proud and bold just moments ago, folded their tails and darted back to the safety of the underbrush. Fireflies blinked twice, their lights dimming, then vanished into the shadows of the trees. Only Krishna remained. The largest of Kaliya's heads leaned forward, its burning eyes narrowing. Water dripped from its fangs like venom, each drop hissing softly as it struck the wet ground. The serpent's tongue flicked once, tasting the air. Its many eyes watched Krishna with equal parts curiosity and threat. "You have entered my grove, little boy," Kaliya hissed, his voice sharp and jagged, like rusted iron scraping against stone. His eyes moved slowly over Krishna, his gaze filled with cold calculation. "You dance as if this place belongs to you." Krishna tilted his head slightly, his smile as soft as the rain itself. "The rain belongs to no one," he replied, his voice calm and clear. "It falls on all, the gentle and the fierce, the humble and the proud." He raised his gaze to meet Kaliya's eyes, not with challenge, but with quiet understanding. "The grove is no one's to own." Kaliya's eyes flashed red. His hood flared wider, his hiss sharp like the crack of lightning. "This grove is mine," he snarled, his coils rising from the water with slow, deliberate menace. His long, scaled body uncurled, revealing more of his massive form. His many heads moved in unison, eyes locked on Krishna. "All that the river touches belongs to me. Every root, every leaf, every stone. This is my domain." He lowered his heads, bringing them closer to Krishna's face. His breath was hot and sharp, reeking of the deep, wet earth of the river's bottom. "Leave now, little boy," Kaliya hissed, his eyes narrowing, "or I will coil around you as the roots coil around stone. There will be no flute to save you." Krishna gazed at him in silence for a moment, his eyes still calm, still steady. He glanced at the shifting coils of Kaliya's body, watching how they moved through the water like slow, twisting clouds of ink. His gaze returned to Kaliya's burning eyes. "Even those who live in darkness," Krishna said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of the first morning sun, "are worthy of the light." The serpent's eyes narrowed in fury. "Do not speak to me of light, child. I have lived where the light cannot reach. I am no lost beast to be saved by your songs." His voice grew louder, harsher. His many heads rose higher, looming like storm clouds gathering over the sea. The air itself grew heavier. "Then be still," Krishna replied simply. His gaze remained calm. He did not step back. With a deafening roar, Kaliya struck. His 5 heads moved in unison, faster than the eye could see. The forest blurred around them, the mist swirling like a whirlwind. But Krishna did not run. He stepped forward, light as a breeze, and in a single fluid motion, leapt. His body rose like a bird taking flight, graceful and smooth, and he landed squarely atop Kaliya's central head. The serpent thrashed wildly. His coils spun, his many heads snapping in all directions. But Krishna's feet pressed down firmly, as steady as the roots of an ancient tree. He placed one foot firmly atop Kaliya's head. His other foot balanced lightly. His arms held out wide for balance. His eyes remained calm. No fear, no anger, only stillness. Kaliya writhed beneath him, his eyes wild with rage. His coils lashed at the water, sending sprays of river mist into the air. But Krishna did not move. His weight was light, but his presence was immovable. His heel pressed down just enough to still the serpent's head. Not with pain, but with the kind of pressure that says, "Be still." "You are seen." The serpent's thrashing slowed. His breathing grew heavy, his many eyes blinking rapidly as the heat of his fury began to cool. His coils loosened. His breath came in slow, heavy huffs. He blinked once, then twice, his sharp gaze now filled with something quieter. Krishna's voice was soft, but firm, like the voice of a father guiding a child. "Return to the depths, Kaliya," he said, his foot still resting lightly on the serpent's head. "The world has not cast you away, though you hide from it. Do not poison it with your anger." Kaliya blinked again. His breathing slowed further. His coils, once tight with rage, now sank slowly into the water. His hood folded, his fangs hidden once more. The rain, still falling softly, washed over him. It poured over his black scales, washing away the heat of his anger. For the first time, Kaliya looked smaller. His many heads lowered, his gaze no longer burning with fury, but quiet, thoughtful. "Why do you show mercy?" he asked, his voice low and tired. His eyes, though dimmer now, remained fixed on Krishna. Krishna gazed at him with the gentleness of dawn breaking over the sea. "Because the rain falls on all, Kaliya, the proud, the lost, and even the feared." Kaliya lowered his heads further until his chin touched the surface of the water. Slowly, he began to sink back into the depths, his gaze never leaving Krishna until his final head vanished beneath the rippling surface. The water grew still once more. For a moment, only the rain remained. The peacocks stepped out from the underbrush. The frogs began to croak softly again. The fireflies blinked back to life, their small lights twinkling in the mist. Krishna stepped down from the smooth stone, his feet pressing lightly into the moss. He glanced at the river, his eyes filled with quiet reflection. His fingers brushed the flute at his side. "Even those who live in darkness," he said quietly, his gaze distant, "are worthy of the light." The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, as if agreeing with him. The rain softened to a gentle drizzle, each drop falling with a delicate plink on the wide leaves of the grove. The once heavy downpour had become a soft mist, light as a silk shawl draped over the forest. The air smelled fresh and new, the sweet scent of wet earth mingling with the fragrance of kadamba flowers. The world was still. Krishna sat on a smooth stone at the center of the grove, his legs folded loosely beneath him. His garland of wildflowers lay in his lap, the petals soaked and heavy, some of them falling off one by one. His yellow dhoti clung to his legs, damp from the rain, but he paid it no mind. His eyes were lowered, gazing at the small pond before him. The surface of the water rippled softly as the rain touched it, each drop creating a perfect circle that spread outward in quiet waves. His reflection stared back at him from the water, a face calm and steady, with eyes deeper than the night sky, and a faint smile that barely lifted the corners of his lips. A single peacock feather, wet and drooping slightly, sat nestled in his hair. The reflection wavered with every drop of rain, bending and twisting his features like the way a dream changes just before waking. He watched it all in silence. Behind him, life slowly returned to the grove. The peacocks, no longer afraid, spread their tails once more, letting the rain glide off their shimmering feathers. The frogs hopped back toward the edges of the pond, their quiet rivets joining the sound of raindrops. Birds rustled in the branches, shaking water from their feathers before settling in their nests. Fireflies blinked on and off, their tiny lights weaving through the air like the slow dance of stars across the night sky. All of them glanced toward Krishna from time to time. None of them spoke, but they watched him, as if waiting for him to say something. He didn't, not at first. Instead, he reached for the flute that lay beside him on the stone. His fingers ran along its smooth surface, tracing the faint grooves where his fingers had pressed so many times before. His gaze shifted to the river beyond the grove. The water was clear again, no longer disturbed by the thrashing of Kaliya's coils. The serpent had gone, slipping back into the depths. Krishna's eyes lingered on the river, thoughtful. He hides in the depths, he murmured to himself, but even there, the rain finds him. He raised the flute to his lips. The first note was as soft as a breath, almost too faint to hear. It moved with the rhythm of the rain, slow and steady, like footsteps on a quiet path. The frogs stopped croaking. The birds grew still. Even the raindrops seemed to fall more slowly, each one landing on leaves with the softest of taps. Then, the next note followed. It was higher, lighter, like the call of a distant bird on a foggy morning. It echoed through the grove, filling every space, every hollow, every crack between the roots of trees. The fireflies blinked in rhythm with the notes. Their tiny lights flared brighter, flickering on and off like the glow of a lantern in the fog. One by one, they floated toward Krishna, their lights moving in slow, steady pulses. The peacocks tilted their heads, their eyes half closed as if listening to a lullaby. The frogs sat still, their wide eyes fixed on him. The flute's melody grew richer, fuller. It was a song of quiet peace, of stillness after the storm. No longer the wild, joyful dance of the rain. It had become something slower, something more reflective. Each note was like a drop of rain hanging at the tip of a leaf, waiting for just the right moment to fall. Krishna's eyes remained half closed, his gaze soft but distant. His fingers moved over the flute with slow precision, each note crafted with care, as though he was weaving something unseen. The melody did not command attention. It did not demand awe. It simply was. Gentle, patient, unrushed. His gaze shifted to the ground at his feet. There, tiny rivulets of rainwater had begun to carve small paths through the moss, forming thin, twisting streams. Water followed the path of least resistance, curling around roots and stones, slowly finding its way to the river. His smile deepened, and his eyes softened even further. He lowered the flute for a moment, his fingers still resting lightly on its surface. "The rain follows no path, yet it always finds its way," he whispered. His eyes lifted to the clouds above, where the grayness had begun to shift to softer shades of silver and pale blue. The storm had passed. The butterfly returned. It appeared suddenly, as if it had never left, its wings flashing bright blue with silver dots that shimmered like stars. It hovered in front of Krishna, its wings opening and closing in slow, deliberate pulses. Krishna raised his hand, palm open. The butterfly floated down, landing softly on his fingertips. "Did you see it all?" Krishna asked it, his voice as soft as the flute's song. His eyes stayed on the butterfly, watching the slow, steady movement of its wings. "Did you see how even the proudest heart can learn to bow?" The butterfly remained still for a moment, then lifted itself back into the air. It circled around him once, twice, before darting away toward the edge of the grove, where the sunlight now peeked through the parting clouds. The rain had stopped. The frogs leapt into the pond. The birds stretched their wings, letting them dry in the golden light. The peacocks, shimmering with 100 tiny droplets of water on their feathers, raised their tails and preened them slowly, each feather catching the light like tiny jewels. Krishna stood, his flute in one hand, his garland of flowers hanging loosely from his shoulders. He glanced at the grove one last time, the glade of smooth stones, the trees older than kings, the river flowing clear and calm. The air was still, but it was no longer heavy. It was light, fresh, like the breath that comes after a long sigh. He walked slowly toward the edge of the grove, his steps as soft as falling leaves. His flute swung lightly in his hand. Birds followed him from the trees, hopping from branch to branch. Fireflies hovered close, blinking softly as they moved with him, as though guiding his path. At the edge of the grove, he stopped. He turned to look back one final time. His eyes fell on the pond, the smooth ripples of rain still fading into stillness. He watched as a single frog hopped onto a lily pad, its eyes watching him with quiet attention. Krishna tilted his head toward it. "Even those who live in the depths of the water," he said, his voice as soft as the hum of the forest, "can rise to see the light." The frog blinked once, and then twice. It did not move. Krishna's eyes lingered on it for a moment, his smile quiet but knowing. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps light, his heart steady, and his eyes as calm as the river he had left behind. The melody of the flute lingered in the air long after he had gone, like the distant sound of rain long after the clouds have cleared. As you close your eyes, let the echoes of this story guide you to peace. Drift gently into sleep, knowing you are part of a world where love and wisdom shine bright. May your dreams be calm, comforting, and filled with wonder.